Hello, my name is Wesley Bowers. I've been a lawyer here in Evansville since 1951. I still have two cases I'm working on, and when those are finished, I hope they're finished this year, I'll be no longer practicing law. I'm afraid I'm going to get Alzheimer's or some such thing, or be out of phase and not know what I'm doing. Of course, I a lot of times didn't know what I was doing, but you have to really keep up. You have to get these seminars and so forth so you can know what the law is and keep up with it. And there's so many different touches to the law that it's difficult to keep up with it. Same time, I used to have research boys that could help me. I don't have those now. When I came to Evansville in 1951, my son was 2 years old, and I had to feed him. That's why I came to Evansville. Scott was a little guy, very nice guy, kind of shy-ish boy. And my wife, my first wife, and I moved here, and we never regretted it. Now, she and I were divorced 20 years ago. She died in December of this year. While she was here, she was head of the Human Relations Commission. We had some difficulties. Then we were divorced in 1969. My son, to my surprise, wanted to be a lawyer. He went to Houston Law School. His grades weren't not good enough to get an IU. He's a brilliant fellow. He's one of the most brilliant men ever I have met. But his problem in college was if he didn't like a course, he didn't pay any attention to it. If he liked it, he got an A. And he could have gotten an A in any course that he ever took. My son was a judge here for 24 years. He is fluent in German. He speaks German without an accent. He taught himself Russian. He is fluent in Russian. He reads Russian and German newspapers every week. He is now teaching himself French, Spanish, and Italian. He is a pool room hustler. He's a chess champion. He is a classical pianist. He's a very unusual fellow. His son, my grandson, is also a very unusual fellow. He graduated from Yale Law School in about 2003, and he's in New York with a big law firm there. I graduated from Indiana University Law School in 1951. While I was there, I was head of the dormitories. That is one section of the dormitories, men's dormitories, and I tried to keep 600 men corralled, and I did a pretty good job of it. I don't think I could do that now. I think it's very difficult. After coming to Evansville, I went to work for a guy named Joe Butt, B-U-T-T. Joe told a story once. He said he got a letter from the IRS which said, "Dear Mr. Butt," and it said his Social Security number, and it gave his address, and it said, "You haven't filed your returns for 6 years, and you're in bad trouble." He wrote back to them, and he said, "Dear sirs," he said, "you wrote me and said you didn't know anything about me, but you had all the information there, including my Social Security number. I want to advise you that if you could find your own butts with your hands in broad daylight, you could find my tax returns." And goodbye. So Joe was a brilliant lawyer from the University of Arkansas. He was head of his class at the University of Arkansas. He came to Illinois and worked for the Carter Oil Company. He became the expert on oil and gas law. He came to Evansville, and he, for a long time, was the principal oil and gas lawyer in this area. He came here in the 40s, and then I joined him in the 50s. We practiced law for a year and hired a fellow named Ellis Anderson. Ellis was a graduate in Indiana University Law School. Ellis came here as a bachelor and left with a daughter and a wife 7 years later. Ellis was a very interesting man. He was about 6'6.5" tall. He had an English accent, which he picked up trying to correct a stutter. He suffered fools not at all. He was a brilliant man. He left here and went to the college, not the college, went to the drug company Baxter in Chicago, became assistant counsel there, then went off to New Jersey, became assistant general counsel to the company, and then became general counsel. Before he left, he had increased his law firm from 4 to 54 lawyers and was senior executive vice president and general counsel. He left the firm to take care of his wife, who unfortunately died of cancer. Ellis was a remarkable fellow. He was a friend of Vance Hardtke, the secretary, the senator from Indiana. Vance was supported by a number of young lawyers. He was supported by me. He was supported by Bill Greif. He was supported by Ellis Anderson and Jim Angermeyer. We all worked for him. We came to have little regard for him, however, after years, as many Americans ceased to have regard for him. The interesting thing was Ellis became the corporate city attorney. It was called then. It's now called corporate counsel, but Ellis became corporate counsel. Then I became attorney for the Air Board. Then I became redevelopment attorney while I was with Joe Val Butt. But I was principally an oil and gas lawyer. That means I dealt with real estate and that sort of thing. It was very dull. We represented every major company in the area. So I stayed with Joe Val Butt for 14 years, and then I left and went with a fellow named Bill Fitzgerald. Bill was a wonderful trial lawyer. He'd been a judge over in Salem, Indiana, North Vernon, one or the other. There was a joint county there, maybe Scott County or something like that. He came here during the World War II and joined a fellow named Darby, Philip Darby. They represented the railroads. When I joined Fitzgerald, he'd had a number of younger lawyers from Evansville with him. He'd had Ted Zemer for a while, and then he had a guy named Bill, can't remember his name, I'll get it later. Bill was just a fascinating guy. I was surprised to learn how nervous he got, though. When I went with him, I'd heard this was the trial lawyer. He'd been a city attorney here. He'd been a judge over in the other county. He was the attorney for Alcoa. He was the attorney for Southern. He was the attorney for L&N Railroad. When I came, he was involved in a trial, or about to be involved in a trial with Fred Bamberger, and he was so nervous, I couldn't believe it. I asked his secretary, how is he so nervous? She says, he hasn't tried a case in a number of years. So I started helping him try cases. Fortunately, I did reasonably well for him. I tried a lot of cases for the railroad, won most of them. I've all lost some bad ones, too, or lost some I shouldn't have lost, I guess. But it was a wonderful experience with Bill. I was with him for 4 years. I drove him to his grave. I caused his heart attacks. He had 2 while he was with me. And the last one he had in 1969, and I went with him in 64. No, it's 68 was his last year. He was a really great guy, storyteller. He used to tell stories. And we walked from 4th and Main. We were in the old Citizens Bank, which is now the Southern something Securities Building. It's had a number of different names. We would go from there down to a pool room and restaurant between 1st and 2nd Streets, and he always referred to me as Senator because I was a state senator. And we would be going down the street, and he would stop about every 10 feet and talk to me, and he'd touch my arm and face me, and we'd face, and it took about 15 minutes to walk those 2 blocks with the judge telling stories and stopping me. It was a wonderful experience. He was a wonderful guy. After Fitz died, Well, I had formed the law firm of Fitzgerald Bowers, Buteau, Harrison, and Kent, and we were there 1 year. With Fitz died in '69. That's right. We were there 1 year from '68 to '69, and then we became Bowers. Well, Buteau, Bowers, Harrison, and Kent, and then Buteau left us, and then it became Bowers, Harrison, and Kent, and then after a while we joined with Dave Miller and 3 or 4 people from his law firm, and after a short while we became the biggest law firm in the city. Unfortunately, at the present time, we are not the biggest law firm in the city. We're getting to be minuscule. I left the firm about 3.5 years ago. It had over 20, 21, 22 lawyers at the time. It now has about 10. I don't know what happened, but that's the story of the firm's shrinkage, you might say. So I've about run out of talking about myself here. Well, I was state senator. I was Democrat, a very liberal Democrat, I might say. I've gotten wisdom, and I'm no longer a liberal Democrat. In fact, I question whether I'm really much of a Democrat, but I've got wisdom now. I'm no longer a young man and sympathetic to the world. I'm an older man with some wisdom. The experience in the legislature was very interesting. He got paid $1,800 a year. The first session I had was in 1963. We were in the minority in that session. The Republicans were in control of the House by a goodly number, and they had 1 vote majority in the Senate. Our big job that year was what to do about taxes, and we finally, after a special session of 40 days, I nearly died because I hadn't planned to be there more than 60. I died financially, that is to speak. We finally passed a program for the first sales tax in Indiana, which was 2%. Indiana cannot go in debt, and we had to do something, and we sat there for nearly 40 days voting for an income tax, and then finally we compromised with a sales tax. I was threatened by the Teamsters Union. They would defeat me if I voted for that bill, and sure enough, I was defeated in the next election, and a grateful public retired me. I was going to be the majority leader of the Senate next year. In 1966, I'm sorry, I misspoke myself. It was in 1960. My term was till 66, and in that election was when I was defeated. The best thing I did while I was in the legislature, I was chairman of the Judicial Study Commission, and we presented a constitutional amendment to redo the judicial system. Unfortunately, when the bill was introduced in '67, it was going down to defeat, just as the effort to do away with township trustees went down to defeat. The Neanderthals came out to defeat this judicial amendment. So what we did, I was time working with people, we gutted the entire constitutional amendment so it applied only to the appellate court and the Supreme Court, and then it passed through, as long as it didn't affect the judges in the smaller counties, or all of the counties, that is to say. The bill and the judiciary was improved by reason of the fact that the judges were appointed by the governor from a panel of 3 people recommended by Judicial Study Commission. that you can't believe how much improved the judiciary was when we took it out of politics, where when the Democrats won, the Democratic judge won. When the Republicans won, the Republican judge won. It was very unsatisfactory. Then we had a wonderful thing. We had Randy Shepard appointed to the Indiana Supreme Court. Then I assisted him in several ways. I helped get him into the Chief Justice's position, and I wasn't on the commission, but I had some influence with some of the people. Then Randy just did such a remarkable job as Chief Justice and continues to this day to be doing a remarkable job. He's a brilliant fellow. He went to Yale Law School, where my grandson went to Yale Law School. But Randy is one of the leading lights in this state in the judicial field. He's probably one of the leading judges in the United States. He sparkles when he walks. He's just a fantastic guy. So that was one of my achievements in the legislature. I was also, a bribe was offered to me in the legislature, and I turned it down. I'm glad I did that. But it was a wonderful experience being in the legislature. I hope other people can get there. So one of the interesting things is people have an idea that legislatures, including Congress of the United States, are composed primarily of lawyers. That is not true. It has never been true. What is the real truth is that the lawyers are acquainted with the law, and also they're smarter than the other legislators, and they get in the leader positions. And lawyers lead the legislatures. They don't, and that's the way they dominate them, is because they know what they're doing, and the other people come from areas where they aren't familiar with laws and legalities and politics primarily, and they are not the majority in any legislative group that I know of. Well, Susan, you want to ask me some questions?
I do. I want to know what inspired you to pick law as a profession.
Well, I was a young fella, I guess 14 or 15 years old, and I wanted to first be an aeronautical engineer, and then I was blinder than a bat. I was very, very nearsighted. And then reading about things, I felt that, hey, as a lawyer, I can really accomplish things working for the government. So in 1951, I went to Washington, D.C. to get a job with the government, and I guess my grades weren't good enough, but anyhow, they turned me down. I didn't get an offer, and that's when I turned back to Indiana and came back here. But my idea was to work for the government. I considered that to be a real opportunity to help people.
Public service.
Public service, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Was there one particular attorney when you mentioned Mr. Fitzgerald, but one particular attorney that was your mentor?
No, Joe Butt was my mentor. My good friend Bill Fitzgerald was my mentor, but while in law school or before law school, no. I was a very poor boy. I knew no lawyers. I was not from a professional. I had an uncle who was a lawyer out in California who had a big law firm there in L.A. I met him when I went to New York when I was about 40 years old.
Really?
And that's the first time I met him. But he had never been involved in my life. And I had an uncle who was vice president of the Indiana National Bank in Indianapolis. And I never really met him till after the World War II. And I had an uncle who was a psychiatrist, and I never met him at all. He died before I was 15 or 16, something like that. So I had no lawyers I knew at all.
Did you do litigation?
Yes. I didn't do it with Joe Butt. And I was maybe in one litigation case. It was terrible. It was unbelievably bad on my part. Then I started learning litigation when I went with Fitzgerald, and of course he was a well-known litigator, and I picked up my stuff from him.
And did well with it. Did a lot of litigation, did you not?
Yes, I did. I was chairman of the Indiana Bar Association's trial lawyers section. I was the president of the Indiana Defense Lawyers Association. I was the editor of the newsletter for the association. I started it. I was a member of the advocates. I can't remember the full name right at this moment, but there is a limited number of lawyers. There are only maybe 10 or 12 or 15 in most states. That's not true. There may be a couple thousand, but it's quite a limited group of lawyers.
Well, were there any particular cases that you found particularly interesting or amusing, or any snafus on the in front of the jury, or anything you'd like to share?
Well, let's see. I know one case we had. It involved a railroad accident, and railroad engines are very big. Yeah. And the guy came in and said he didn't see it. He was injured and suing us for a few $100,000. And he said, I didn't see that thing. And so I got up and I said to the jury, you know, in St. Matthew's, I think it is, chapter so-and-so, verse so-and-so, it says, what does a profit a man if he has eyes and seeth not, and he has ears and he hears not? I won that case. But when I went back, my secretary had been there, and she says, you hypocrite, she says, you were up there expounding Bible to these people. Why, you don't even go to church. So that was reasonably funny. Okay. Now, a big case I had was with Ted Lockyer. Ted was an outstanding lawyer here in Evansville. He and I didn't get along together. He threw my partner Fitzgerald out of his office. He ordered me out of his office. He was a little he was a little angry. He'd pop off. He'd explode. And I think he even threw a pencil at Fitzgerald. But he was difficult. He was difficult to get along with. I don't know why he did those things, and he did some other things which I couldn't understand because he was really a bright lawyer. He went to Vanderbilt in law school, and I'm sure was a great student there. Ted was quite something. Well, I got a reputation for being his enemy, and as a result, I got a couple of cases. I got a case involving the Meade Johnson. They called me when John Breckinridge, their former general counsel and so forth, sued them under the job discrimination laws, and Lockyer represented him. At first, Breckinridge was represented from some big shot from Cleveland. Finally, Breckinridge realized this big shot didn't know what he was doing, and he got Lockyer. And they settled for a six-figure sum. Now, I wasn't the one that did the settlement. They had some big lawyers from New York City. But they brought me in because I was an enemy of Ted Lockyer's. Then we had...
Hold.
Lockyer rented space to Doran Perdue, who was one of the outstanding presidents of the Evansville Bar Association. If I may, I'll talk a little about him later. But Lockyer and he got in a fight about rent and all that sort of thing. So they, Doran came to me to represent him. Lockyer sued Doran, and I said, well, I'll represent you, but I'm not going to do it for free. I'll fight him, but I'm not going to fight him just for nothing, and I'll do as good a job as I can. So he hired me, later complained about my bill. But The lawsuit was rather interesting because the building was owned by Joni Lockyer, and I think maybe entirely Joni. It wasn't Ted's building. And then Ted was represented by another outstanding lawyer in Evansville named Bob Hahn. And Bob and Ted were very close people. One of the things I didn't like what Hahn did in that case was I had said to Lockyer, you know, I can send a summons out to your house and so forth. Or I guess maybe we had sued. I think, yeah, we'd sued Lockyer. And so I said, I can send the summons out to your house, but you can pick it up at the sheriff's office or something, whatever. Well, he said, that's okay. Well, then we got to court. Hahn said, well, Mrs. Lockyer is not here. And I said, well, I just talked about, yeah, he talked to Ted and said, it's okay, we'll pick the summons up and so forth. He said, well, that was for Ted, that wasn't for Mrs. Lockyer. That made me a little angry, you understand? Mm-hmm. And I thought that Hahn, Bill Powell, a former president of the Bar Association, became a good friend of his, and he told me, well, Bob will always follow the letter of the law, never the spirit of the law, and you got to be careful when you deal with him. He only says what he means and means what he says, and it's very limited. I thought that was not a very good way to practice law.
Interesting.
Now, Doran Perdue?
Doran Perdue.
Doran Perdue was really the father of our modern Evansville Bar Association. I'm not sure to what extent Paul Arnold contributed to that. I think it was Paul. Paul was the first important president. Then he was followed by Doran. And together they organized the bar to have a executive secretary, and voila, we got Susan Helfrich, and then we became a wonderful organization. And before that, all we were was a luncheon club. We didn't do anything. We went to have lunch, and nothing was done, except one thing. Okay? You ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. I think it was 1959, before McDonald was elected mayor of, Frank McDonald Sr. was elected mayor of Evansville. There was a fellow named Tommy Trimble, a lawyer. He was a pedestrian lawyer, and he was mostly a JP lawyer, and he was over with the JPs in the courthouse. Among other things, there was a lady who allegedly was a prostitute. She had a house, very nice house, and it was 3 bedrooms and brick or something, but it was a very nice house. Lockyer got a judgment against her for, no, not Lockyer, Trimble. Trimble got a judgment against her for $150 or some such thing. And then her house was sold. And it was sold by the sheriff, of course. And here's this house worth $15,000, sold for $150. Well, what came out of all of this? The newspapers then became hysterical, as newspapers will with things of that sort. And people started investigating, and it looked like Tommy had done some unusual things, like not serving papers on the lady and this kind of thing. Sewer service, we called it, where the process server would throw it in the sewer instead of serving it on the lady and then make false returns. We were appointed, that is, Bob Norton and Sid Berger and I were appointed as a committee to investigate this situation. Now, it was a very interesting case at the time because McDonald went on the television. He was going to run for mayor, and he cried. I didn't do anything wrong. And he wept like Churchill and others like
Frank
him.
Sr. Frank
Frank
McDonald Sr.
McDonald Sr.
Yeah.
He was afraid that he was going to be flushed down the toilet. So we investigated. Finally, Berger and Norton, Bob Norton, and I came up with a finding of 37 violations of the ethics rules by Tom Trimble.
Wow.
Well, we went to the Bar Association and made our report. Joe Hatfield Sr., a wonderful fellow, a wonderful trial lawyer, and a gentleman of the first order. He, as most lawyers, didn't want this. We can't judge our fellow lawyers. We can never say anything bad about them. And although the circumstances were outrageous, Mrs. Hatfield told us that later she had to get Joe out of town. He was nearly ready to die from the stress of having to judge his fellow lawyer and this sort of thing. Well, I think we came through with 1 or 2 votes, about 51 to 49 or some such thing, to condemn Trimble and send to the Indiana Supreme Court a recommendation he be disbarred.
This went before the entire bar?
Of Evansville, yes.
My
They had to
mama.
vote the whole thing.
That's interesting.
And I think it was so close, it was 51 to 49, very, very close. As I said, people don't like to do this. They don't like to judge things. And doctors do that, and policemen do that. They don't like to judge their fellows.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Hatfield nearly cratered, but we made a recommendation. Went to Supreme Court, and amusingly enough, the Supreme Court issued an opinion not condemning Trimble, but saying the bar should take him under our wings, and we should teach him. We should teach him about ethics and that sort of thing. And they did nothing except recommend that we give him lessons in ethics. I don't remember who his lawyer was, but his lawyer did a pretty good job of it.
It sounds as if. When did that change? Wes, do you know?
When did it change? When we got a judicial study commission from my amendment, not my amendment, my commission's amendment to the Constitution creating a disciplinary commission.
So that's when that happened.
Well, that happened in 1967 when the General Assembly passed the bill. Then it'd be passed in 69, and it was adopted in the next election or something. It has to go through a 3-stage procedure.
But that a disciplinary commission was then established statewide.
Right. Now we have, at the time of Trimble's, the Trimble incident, let's call it, there was maybe one person disbarred a year. And they were disbarred because they voluntarily disbarred themselves. No one ever passed judgment on it.
Okay.
That's not entirely true. Occasionally, when they killed somebody or wiped out 3 or 4 members of their family or something like that, they did something of that kind. But generally, there wasn't. The Supreme Court had to handle all the disbarments, and then they couldn't do it. They weren't equipped to do it, and they didn't want to do it. Now there are 50 or 60 lawyers disbarred each year. Mm-hmm. So it's a remarkable difference.
It's a service to the public to keep the profession.
Well, yes, you want to get rid of really bad people. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court frequently lets all the bad guys back in after about 5 or 6 years. But once you're never disbarred for life. It doesn't seem, unless you die before you can file a petition, or
to get
you decide you don't want to do it. But generally, generally speaking, everybody who applies for readmission to the bar gets admitted.
Gets a second chance.
Yeah, and that's kind of nice that they do that. But then you get some really bad people. There are people like Bodagovich that never learn. You give them a second chance, and that's another chance. Fill in your pockets.
All right. I'll ask you a question that I've asked everybody. Of all the people that you've known in the practice, living or dead, who would you like to hear give an oral history? Who would you like to hear about the most?
Who would I like to hear an oral history from the most? Jeepers, I wish I could really say that. I guess I'm gonna have to think. We'll come back to that. I'm sorry I didn't read my
That's okay.
instructions, and I'm not prepared to say at this moment. David Miller, who was one of my partners, is one of the most outstanding trial lawyers in the city. I would like to hear what he's got to say. Bill Powell, a friend of mine, a very witty, charming, intelligent lawyer, died 20 years or so ago. I would like to have heard his oral history. I just don't know at this moment who, other than those couple of guys, that I would really like to hear from. I guess I'd like to hear something from John Klaus because he was a very funny fellow, and he had an interesting career. I'd like to hear about his escapades with ladies more than I would his law deal. He was married 6 times, twice to the same woman. And 9? 9? Oh, all right. There's 9 times. Oh boy, that was interesting. Bob Norton is dead, so I can't hear. So many of these people I might want to hear from are dead.
Well, that's what I said. Living
I'm 82 years old now, and a lot of guys have gone by the way.
I understand that. What do you see as the biggest difference now? I mean, you use email and you use
computers, electronics.
Do you see that as the biggest difference between when you started and now, or?
Oh, I think I see a number of differences. I've seen improvements in the court. We had lousy judges. We had terrible judges under this elected procedure. Oh gosh, we had some lightweights like John Rawlings, who was a wonderful man, and Benjamin Benny Sr., who was a wonderful man, but they didn't know law from deep center field. And then there was a guy, I think his name was McCrae, I can't remember exactly, but he was not very good. He even became an appellate court judge, and he wasn't any good. We had a guy who was a very brilliant fellow, I can't remember his full name right at the moment. Warren Merrill and Cohn. Merrill. Judge Merrill. He was drunk by 10:30 in the morning. Judge Reeves was one of the most intemperate in terms of temperament that I ever met. He was a mean man. I would like to have heard maybe from our good friend Jimmy Lopp Sr., but he's dead. Jimmy was a very interesting person in the law profession. He was a brilliant student. He graduated law school in 2 years. And he of course, didn't go to the war, and he got all the divorce ladies, and seeing all these women around him like a bunch of little chickens over in the courthouse when we had divorce day. That was an outrage. And the law took 40 years to improve on it. You know, you had to have 2 witnesses swear to deliver. Now you don't have to have that. But that used to have all those women over there. And Jimmy would go around. He quit smoking. And lady, he had a list of women, maybe 20 or 30 women, every Friday. And he'd say, Miss Smith here. Miss Smith, how much money you need? $10? Okay. Mrs. Jones, and he'd go all against these ladies, and he'd go in. It was a very terrible production line, but Jimmy was really anti-communist. Interestingly enough, he was also against fluoride in water. He was dead. He's considered that poison, and it is poison, but we haven't died from it. Anyone I know has died of fluoride poison. But he considered it a communist conspiracy to poison our water supply. And you looked at the man, here's a really smart fellow. And he was a lot better lawyer than he appeared to be in this divorce milieu.
Did he file a suit on the fluoride issue? Was he part of that suit?
I don't remember.
I thought somebody mentioned that.
But here was a guy worth millions of dollars, and he was worried about the world and all these communists and everything. and how you couldn't do anything. And, hey, when you got that much money, why worry? But he was a very, very likable guy. I would like to have heard from him. Oh, Marion Rice. Oh, Marion was a sweetheart. He was so outrageous. He was mostly a criminal lawyer. Rice would and Olson were a team, Mutt and Jeff team, over in the city court before I came here, and they were on the radio, and they would do a Miss Judy, a Judge Judy job on these people, and they make fun of these. One was a prosecutor and one was a defense lawyer, and they just chew these people up, just make fun of them. And it was a big show here in Evansville. They loved that show. Mm-hmm. I never saw it.
I just remember that my mother went with her mother to city court all the time for entertainment.
Well, it was entertaining back when you had those guys on. They were really something. I don't think I ever entertained anybody over there. Jack Kane had a lot of clients over there.
He said that.
And he was kind of entertaining. Bill Powell, the president of the bar, he was a deputy prosecutor, and I used to go over in the evening when he had the evening court, we'd go drink some beer afterwards and sit there and listen to things. It was very, very interesting.
Was there an attorney, and I'll ask you this, was there an attorney you dreaded most going up against because of their skill or talent, and that would be a compliment to them, just to say that?
Well, I realize, well, you always had to be careful when you went up against Bob Hahn. In my first case, I beat him, so I was very pleased about that. You had to be careful when you went up against Ted Lockyer. You had to be careful when you went up against Bob Norton. Bob was a very careful lawyer, very, very well-prepared lawyer. You certainly had to be prepared when you went up against Dave Miller. Dave was a partner of mine. Before he was a partner, we were acquaintances. And he had sued us for a ton of money and the Southern Railroad, and we offered him $300,000. I think he told me it was a little less than that, but my recollection was $300,000, and he didn't take it. And to my astonishment, the railroad got a verdict against him, and he sat out in the curb later. Well, he sat out in the curb later. And one of the interesting things was there were more people at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for that verdict than I'd ever seen at the federal courthouse. I think it was Gene Brooks's birthday. His wife was there. He was there. Friends of his were there. I think my wife might have been there. It was amazing how many people were there. That was the longest trial they ever had in federal court.
Oh, my.
Mm-hmm. So.
And you won.
And I won. We had another case where Lockyer sued us for about $9 million. There was a fellow killed out here on 41, and I was kind of concerned about that. I was really concerned about it because while the trial was going on, the arms at the crossing that came down to keep traffic, they were sticking, and they were, oh boy, it was. And I came into court and I called them, get out there and get those up in the air, and get them up in the air, and get them out of the way. If that jury's coming, most of the jury was coming from Jasper, okay?
Oh, my.
And I said, my God, they're going to down 41, and here's a railroad. So they got him up in time. But we had a long trial. That trial was very, very interesting. I won that one also, and I think I should have won it. But
very good.
So we won that one. I had a trial in federal court involving our good friend Doran Perdue, and one of the fine lawyers. I think it was Jimmy. It starts with M. He's dead. Marchand. I think it was Jimmy Marchand, and Doran. He called in Doran for the oil and gas aspects of it. That was an interesting trial because I called one of my witnesses, And I looked at him and thought, what's wrong with him? And he's like this. He was drunk. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and he was drunk on the witness stand. It was just incredible. That was also an incredible jury trial. It lasted 2 weeks. I lost 15 pounds in that jury trial. I needed to. It was a very complicated case. It involved constitutional law. It involved a judge, Bill Steckler, who originally was from Mount Vernon, Indiana, and at one time he was the only federal judge we had in the Southern District. And I cannot believe what Bill Steckler did in that case. And he was always a friend of mine. He was married to the funniest woman in the world. Mrs. Steckler was just a delightful woman. Her name was the 60-second the hair ointment, the 60-second rub down. I remember when I first met her, Judge, I was trying to escape the judge. He was boring. He was very, very boring. And he was at French Lick, and he was over here with a bunch of lawyers, and I was over here. And he stood up, Senator, Senator, he says, come over, come over. And I had to reluctantly go, my friends, I would like you to meet Senator Bowers from Evansville, Indiana, and this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so. And then he introduced his wife, who started a V. It's a very well-known hair...
Vitalis?
Vitalis. Yeah, her name was Vitalis. And he's my wife, Vitalis. I said, Vitalis? She says, yes, I give Bill a 60-second rub down every morning. And we went around. Oh, she was so funny. But in this case, it was very interesting because the plaintiff was trying to recover some oil and gas leases on the basis he never heard of this lawsuit that Judge Dillon had been the lawyer in, and Judge Dillon had quieted the title, and they were saying that they should have found him in the records of the courthouse, among other things. But one of the things that after the case was over, and my older partner Butt settled the case, after the case was over, and these leases were worth about $250,000, this plaintiff was from New York. He was brought in chains, New York. He'd just been found guilty of the largest securities fraud in the United States history. He wasn't Madoff, but that was $54 million at the time, and we're talking about 14 from 58, 44 years ago, okay? And they brought him in here. Doran later told me, you know, I was astonished. She said, Judge Steckler, who's now dead, Judge Steckler brought him into his office. I said, he did what? Yes, while the trial was going on, Judge Steckler brought him into his office. And he told the man, well, Mr. Schuler, or whatever his name was, he said, I want you to know that's not in the law of Indiana. You have to stand with a shotgun and protect your property. Now, I wasn't there. Doran was there, and the judge was there, and the plaintiff was there. I wasn't there. And here was a judge who was widely known as a very, very ethical judge. And I could not comprehend him doing that. But he did that. So, now, returning to Doran Perdue, you want to hear about Doran Perdue?
Yep. Give us Doran.
Okay. Doran, as I say, with Paul Arnold, I don't know which one was primarily responsible for your appearance, but they worked together, I think. I think Paul was the president and Doran was the president-elect, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And they hired you, and what a wonderful thing that was for the Bar Association, because you've been such an outstanding director of this association, and everything it's achieved in that time, has been achieved largely by you, by kicking the presidents to do what they ought to do. But Doran and I were friends. Doran went with Joe Butt after I left Butt, and he went in there with the office. He used my furniture, my $2,500 set of furniture. He used it for a year, so a number of years free. And Doran had been with the Ashland Oil Company for a number of years, and we used to represent Ashland, and I talked to him, and he used to quibble about my fees. And then when he became a lawyer, he charged fees you wouldn't believe the fees he charged. And then he became very wealthy because he became an oil man, too. But Doran was a great, pretty fine, outstanding lawyer, and Doran became a very good friend of Pat Shoulders. They became very close for some unusual reason. Then I was talking about the difference in age, okay? Then Doran was killed in an accident down in Florida, and that was a tragedy.
Horrible accident.
I think somebody crossed the median and hit him head on.
Yes.
I think
That's
he was
exactly what happened.
about 60 years old or so. So
That is correct.
he was really the father of our modern bar association.
He was. Indeed he was. I will share something. You know what he did best, or what he did that was really a benefit to the Bar Association? Some liquor store went out of business, and he went in and bought all the remaining liquor, and the bar had liquor to set up bars for 15 years.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
I'd been over every day.
There you go. I think we're good. You were going to say something. I don't want to stop you.
Well, I've got an all senior moment. I forgot what I was going to say. Okay.
Oh, me too.
So we've been very fortunate in the bar presidents we had up until the new regime when you became the executive secretary. They didn't do much, and after that, then lawyers started doing things, coming up with ideas, and really making ours a dynamic association. I think one of the best associations in the state of Indiana. Now, although I was president of the bar, I'm not trying to claim anything for doing that, but you know, there have just been some outstanding bar association people. There have been the judges, like Helt and others that have been really great. I don't know who thought we ought to get the judges in there, but it was a good idea. And then we've had some great lady presidents too. The charming, lovely lady Frank. She's outstanding, and then Sasha, Kasha. Not only is she smart, she's just so funny. She's one of the funniest people you'll ever. She used to be a stand-up comedian.
She did.
In nightclubs somewhere, before she became a lawyer. So we've had some very interesting people. You talk about things. I remember one incident a number of years before you appeared on the scene. We went to the country club, and Galen Clark was the president at the time, and Galen became so drunk that he was unable to pronounce the names. It was the funniest meeting, and Galen was very serious, very fine lawyer, but he was a serious duck, and that was just such a funny event. He lost it. He got a little drunk. And
Nobody ever got drunk. Not really.
We had some of our visitors get drunk. We had the guy from Texas, famous lawyer.
Racehorse Haynes.
Who?
Racehorse Haynes. Racehorse Haynes? Yeah.
And we had Judge, later Governor Brannigan. Brannigan and Fitzgerald were very great buddies from childhood. And Brannigan gave the Alcoa business to Fitzgerald. I mean, he knew them, and they asked him, and he gave it. I mean, said, "Get Fitzgerald." But Brannigan came down here to make a speech to the Bar Association. He got drunk, as was his wont. He frequently got drunk. He got drunk when he was governor and I was senator. He was drunk most of the days. But he wasn't as bad as Craig from up at Brazil, Indiana. Craig got carried out of a press club deal by the state police horizontally. He got so drunk. But Brannigan was drunk at the old McCurdy Hotel. He was up on the balcony at the governor's suite or president's suite or something, and I don't remember who it was. It might have been John Early, but whether we were some of us sitting around drinking and having a good time, or at least we thought we did. And one of us said, once one of them said, "Oh, you ought to see Brannigan. He's there in the suite, and the door's open, and he's got red shorts on, and he's passed out drunk." So we thought we'd go see that, and sure enough, we went back and looked in the door. He'd passed out drunk, and he was in his red shorts. There was a fellow named Joe Minor, a minor lawyer of no consequence, but Brannigan knew him and Early knew him, and when Brannigan became governor-elect, somebody told him, and a bunch of guys, lawyers, he was very high on lawyers, told him, "Well, Governor," he said, "you know, Minor's telling this story about you down there." No, it wasn't Minor, it was John Early. John Early is telling stories about you down in Evansville, Indiana, how you were passed out drunk and so forth. And quicker than a flash, Brannigan says, "You tell that SOB that my first act as governor will to be pardon him for adultery." I thought that was pretty funny. Brannigan was one of the funniest men ever lived. You would go to a dinner and he would make a speech and your stomach would hurt from laughing. And lawyers thought he was a great governor prospect because he was the funniest man they'd ever heard. Turned out to be a terrible governor, except he was an honest governor. But he ruined the mental health department. Mm-hmm. He thought the president of IU and the president of Purdue were members of the mafia. We had passed a bill in 1965 that outlawed the death penalty, and we went to a meeting, a bunch of leaders of the legislature, and said, "Governor, the House has passed this bill, and we've passed a bill, and theirs doesn't provide for no parole, and ours provides for parole." Well, it really made no difference because the governor has parole power, and he could parole anybody. But he says, "I'll take the non-parole bill by you senators," okay? We went back and we passed the bill. And on his representation, he would sign it. Mm-hmm. A couple days later, a state trooper was gunned down by a husband. He went to arrest him or something, and the guy shot him with a shotgun and killed him. And so Brannigan not only said, "Well, I've reconsidered because of the death of this trooper," but he said, and I want to make it an issue in the campaign, in the legislators' campaigns. I was just flabbergasted. Here he goes out of his way to say that it would be an election issue and they could. So that was the kind of guy he was.
Well, Wes, I think you had some great stories. We very much appreciate it.
Okay.
Is there anything else you want to share?
No, I don't think. I might just keep you going forever. I don't know.
Well, if there's...
I might say we've had some wonderful presidents, Paul Black and Carl Helt and Ted Lockyer and Sid Berger and others, Bill Powell and Galen Clark and Pat Shoulders, just a number of outstanding presidents of this organization.
Well, thank you for being one of those.
Okay.
Thanks.